So the Gemara asks the following kash on the top of Daf Lamed Heyam and Beis. Sof lav bar tashlumin. It's very odd if you want to derive conclusions about the equation between Mezid and Shogeg in a case of Chayvi Malkios, that in both cases he's going to be potter from Tashlumin, even though he's a Shogeg. And you're going to derive it from this parsha of Makeh Hakah She'ein Bo Shava Pruta. If it's a Makeh Hakah She'ein Bo Shava Pruta, then Lav Bar Tashlumin. There's no Chiyuv Mama. So it could be, if you want to play the devil's advocate, that we will make a distinction between Shogeg and Mezid, in which case in Shogeg he would be Chayav in Tashlumin. This despite the parsha here of Chovel b'Chaveru b'Hakah she'ein bo shava pruta, because in that case there is no Tashlumei Mammon. But if there would have been a Tashlumei Mammon, namely there would have been Hakah she'ein bo shava pruta, then it's very possible and plausible that we would distinguish between a case of Shogeg and a case of Mezid. And in Achinami, he would only be potur from Tashlumei Mammon in Hakah she'ein bo shava pruta if he were a Mezid. But if he were a Shogeg, in which case Bezdin is not going to implement the punishment of Malchus, then maybe in such a case, he would have to pay Mammon.
But how do you know that if he's a Hakah she'ein bo shava pruta, he doesn't get Malchus? He shouldn't get Malchus.
If it's a Hakah she'ein bo shava pruta, we certainly assume that he gets Malchus because he violates the lav. And then now we have the issue which we're addressing, and we're trying to figure out what the Torah would say as to whether or not he's chayav mamam. And in this particular case, where Bezdin will implement a chiyuv malchus, kuliyabalo pligi, both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish derive the conclusion that he doesn't have to pay mamam because Bezdin is implementing a chiyuv malchus. However, the Gemara now is arguing from the opposite standpoint, that since the parsha, as you've proven, is talking about a case of Hakah she'ein bo shava pruta, how can you derive conclusions and equate Shogeg to Mezid in a case when there's no Chiyuv Tashlumin at all? It could be in a case where there would be a Chiyuv Tashlumin. In Ochinami, we would insist on a differentiation between Mezid and Shogeg. In a case of Shogeg, where he doesn't get Malchus before, in actuality, he would have to pay Mammon. And the Gemara answers, Lo tzricha, what's the case that this Hekesh is teaching me? Lo chilakta bein Mezid with Shogeg. That's the Bahadi de Machye. As he was hitting his friend, Korashirayim Dile, he ripped the shirt on the back of the Mukeh. And in such a case, the Beged is worth more than a Shava Pruta, and yet the Torah is telling me that he's potter from Tashlumin. And that's based on the equation to Makeh Behema in this Hekesh, because Makeh Behema lo chilaktabo, and therefore, likewise, in the case of Makeh Adam lo chilaktabo. So here's a case where the Torah is telling you that even though he was Shogeg, he's going to be potur from paying damages for ripping his friend's shirt. Amalei Rav Chia l'Rava u'letana debei Chizkiya di'omer Makeh Adam u'Makeh Behema. We now are taking to task the drasha of Tana debei Chizkiya, because Tana debei Chizkiya must be assuming that we're talking about a case of chol. And what does that mean? That he was Makeh Behema b'yamos hachol. Had he done it on Shabbos, then that comes under a malach of Shabbos called Netilas Neshama, or in the language of the Mishnah, in Klal Gadol of Shochet. And that would engender a chiyuv misa. So the Gemara says, let's again play the devil's advocate. Maybe the Torah in this parsha of Makeh Behema is talking about Makeh Behema not be mechol, where clearly he has a chiyuv tashlumin, but perhaps and lekal afluge, And therefore, we're not going to be machalik bein shogeg lemezid because Adam muad liolam, when he's mazik his friend's property, he's always going to be chayav, even in a case of shogeg. And then by virtue of the hekesh to maka Adam, again you're going to equate shogeg with mezid. How does Tanad Vechizkiah have the audacity of doing so? Dilma b'Shabbos ksiv. Maybe the parsha is talking about a case of maka behema on Shabbos, or even a case of maka behema on Shabbos. He violates Isur Shabbos, and if he had done so b'mezid, he would be chayav misa for violating Melechas Shabbos. The behema gufa ikal lefluge. Now, with regard to behema itself, because everybody agrees that Eino Memis Umashalim, that there's Kim Levi the Rabbi Minei in a case where he's Chayav Misa, and you could have Maka Behema where he's Chayav Misa. We've been assuming in the context of Tanad Bechizkiah that Maka Behema is a case where he's Chayav Mama, and that's all he's Chayav. How do you know that? Maybe he's Chayav Misa. It's talking about a Hak Hakos Behema on Shabbos. And now we have no choice but to differentiate between Mezid and Shogeg. And therefore, the whole carpet under the legs of this hekesh just completely is removed, because the hekesh and the derivation of Tanad Vechizkiah is predicated on the assumption that in Maka Behema lo chilakta bein mezid l'shogeg. That's not true, because in Maka Behema we have to differentiate between mezid and shogeg because the case is Maka Behema on Shabbos. And the Gemara answers Osalka Daif. Don't even entertain this possibility that we're talking about Shabbos. The pasuk says, "Umaka behemi shalmena, umaka adam yumas." So we're talking about a case where we could put the person to death for the criminal act of murder. Hey, chidami, what's the situation? If there was no asra, how could the Torah say yumas? Can't put a person to death without a hasra. Okay, don't ask me from Adam Zomim, because Adam Zomim is the exception to that rule. And don't ask me from Bav and Machteres, because that's the exception to the rule. Ela Pshita, we have no choice. The Asrube, I mean, that's something we could have figured out on our own. So there was Hasra. No, Eva Shabbos is Makabemi Shalmena. How could it be that the Torah says he pays for damages for killing an animal on Shabbos, and that animal is the possession that's worth something in the market of so-and-so? How could you tell me that you have to pay for that when you're chayav misa for violating the Shabbos? Elo la b'chol. It must be a case of chol. Okay. Now, Rabbi, at this point, we go back to Rabbah. Rabbah we studied yesterday at great length on Daf Lamed Daled.
Just before we go back to Rabbah, so we're at the end of the day here. Where are we holding here between?
At the end of the day, we have the drasha of Tanad Bechizkiah that's going to teach us that lo chilakta bein mezid l'shogeg, and although that's only a case of misa and mammon, because the Torah speaks about maka adamos yumas. And here, even Rabbi Yochanan, according to the new version, Rabbi Yochanan would agree that Eino Meshalim Umes, even if he doesn't get the actual punishment, he was a shogeg, and that's the hekesh that we call the inverse hekesh of Tanad Bechizkiah. Reish Lakish is going to go a step further, and based on either Abaye's understanding of a Zeir Shav of Rosh, which apparently Rabbi Yochanan never had, or according to Rava's understanding of a hekesh, of hakah in the final version, we can extend that halacha of lokilakabo ben mezid with shogeg to the case of chayvi malchus. And therefore, if a person was makes chavero hakah she yeshba shavapruta, he would not have to pay damages even if he were a shogeg. And Rabbi Yochanan never had it. Okay, getting back to Rabbah, because we're, again, very, very pressed for time, and we want to fit in Rabbah. Rabbah, if you recall, said that Rabbi Meir's Shita is that in a case of a chiyuv knas, you don't pay I'm sorry, you pay for the knas. In other words, you don't apply the principle of kim lebed and rabine. That was called a Torah chidsha. And therefore, according to Rabbah, the brisa that we had about a person who steals and then he shechts on Shabbos or on Yom Kippur, or the case of Shara Niskal, according to Rabbi Meir, it's talking about a case of Toveach al Yidei Atzmo, not through a Shliach. And there's no pur in Knas of Daled Vehei, as long as it's a Chiyav Ganov on Erev Shabbos. For Daled Vehei, it's a Knas, no pur of Kim Levi the Rabbim. And now we go back to Rabbah. Rabbah explains that there's no contradiction between our Mishnah here in Ksubas and the Mishnah in Makis. Our Mishnah is talking about a case of a Chiyuv Knas b'chayvei lavim. And in chayvei lavim, in a case of Knas, going with Rabbi Meir's Shita, the way Rabbah interpreted Rabbi Meir, he will pay the Knas. The Mishnah in Makis, on the other hand, that says that in Chayvei Lavim you get Malchus, that's based on the principle of Ein Adam Loke U'Mishalem. And that's not talking about Knas. Amalei Rav Popel Abai LeRabba Di Omar, Rabba who said that according to Rabbi Meir, Chidichu Shechitch Torah B'Knas, the Afal Gav de Miktal Mishalem, even in a case where he's Chayav Misa, he pays the Knas. Masnisen Keman Mukible, which Tana is going to run consistently as the author of the Mishnayos. Ike Rabbi Meir holds that in the case of Knas, the halach is Loke U'Mishalem. And that works out very well with our Mishnah here. In the case of Mamzeres or Achoso, where there's a Chiyuv Malchus, and we're going to impose the Knas based on Rabbi's understanding of Rabbi Meir, then in Knas, there is no Kim Lev the Rabbimine, but Kasha Bito. In the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beis, it says that a Baal Abito, he's parted from Knas. Why? Because of Kim Levi the Rabbimine. Bito is a Chiyuv Misa. Now, according to Rabbi Meir, in Knas, we don't have a principle of Kim Levi the Rabbimine according to Rabbah. So how will we survive the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Vav about Bito according to Rabbah? The Ikra Mechuni ben Akana. And if you want to tell me that our Mishnah according to Rabbah should be attributed to the authorship of Rabbi Mechuni ben Akana, who holds that with regard to a Chiyuv Malchus and Tashlumin, the halacha is Loke U'Mishalem. And this, Rashi explains, is based on a Gemara back on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, where Rabbi Mechuni ben Akana says that on Yom Kippurim, he is potur from Tashlumin because Yom Kippurim engenders a Chiyuv Kares, and Kares patus from Tashlumin. But Malchus does not pater you from Tashlumin. Hence, we understand our Mishnah here that he pays Knas, but Kasha Achoso. Wait a second. Achoso, as opposed to Mamzeres, engenders a Chiyuv Kares. And in the case of a Chiyuv Kares, Rabbi Mechuni ben Akana holds that Kares paters you from Tashlumin. And yet the Mishnah includes Achoso under the Chiyuv Knas. Why would you pay Knas in the case of a Chiyuv Kares? The Ikra Rabbi Yitzchak, in the third parak of Masechet Makis, Rabbi Yitzchak is of the opinion that Chayvei Krisus never get Malchus, never ever get Malchus, and therefore Baal Achoso is Chayav Knas. And now we understand our Mishnah, and there cannot be a Chiyuv Malchus to pater him from Knas because it's a Chiyuv Kares, but Kasha Mamzeres. In the case of Mamzeres, which is only a Chiyuv Lav, the Mishnah says he's Chayav Knas. Now, he's Chayav Knas in the case of the Malchus. Why don't we say that Malchus should pater him up from Knas? Because you're going according to Rabbi Yitzchak, who holds that only Kares paters you from Mammon. from paying any damages, but Malchus patters you from a chiyuv mamon. And here there's a long discussion here in the Rashba. Why can't we combine Rabbi Yitzchak with Rabbi Meir, who says Loka Mishalim? But we're assuming now, and that's what the Rashba works hard to prove, that Rabbi Yitzchak rejects Rabbi Meir. And if Rabbi Yitzchak would hold in the case of Malchus, Eino Mishalim. So what are we going to do with Mamzeres, where the Mishnah says that he pays Knas? Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan, if we combine Rabbi with Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that Chayvei Malchus Shogegim Einam Niftarim Imama, and therefore, who Nami Mitaris look Rabbi Yochanan, that our Mishnah is talking about a case where there's no Asra. And if there was no Asra, then we come under the case of Chayvei Malchus Shogegim, and he pays according to Rabbi Yochanan, that's fine. Ela Isa, Rish Lakish, want to open the possibilities here, and we can reconcile Rabba with Rish Lakish, then we're really in trouble. Rish Lakish is of the opinion that even Chayvei Malchus Shogegim, right, as we said over and over again, the Maisa Vera would generate Malchus, that patters you from Mama. Is Heichim Mitaritzla. How are you going to understand our Mishnah that says that you get Malchus? Again, once again, there's a long discussion here about how Rish Lakish himself will explain the Mishnah. Al Karchach, the Gemara says we have to conclude that there's no peace between Rabbah and Rish Lakish, and we can only reconcile Rabbah in terms of our Mishnah based on Rabbi Yochanan's spirulay, that Rabbah accepts Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara asks a kasha on Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish was of the opinion that even Chayvei Malchio Shogegin are Pturim, they don't pay Tashlumin. Amalei Rav Masnal Abayi Rish Lakish the Omer Beferish Ribsa Torah Chayvei Malchius ke Chayvei Misos. Again, we had two versions of what exactly that meant, Abayi and Rava. So it means that Chayvei Malchius Shogegin do not pay Tashlumin according to Rish Lakish, just like Chayvei Misos Shogegin don't pay Tashlumin. Is man Tana de Poliga later Rabbi Mechuni ben Akana? Who is this phantom Tana who rejects Rabbi Mechuni ben Akana? He says that Yechayev Mamon in a case of Chayvei Krisis. Like, for example, our Mishnah in the case of Achoso says that you pay Knas. So that Tana is the Tana who disagrees with Rabbi Mechuni ben Akana. Because Rabbi Nechuni ben Akana, you remember, was of the opinion that Kares patters you from Tashlumin. And now we're talking about Achoso, which is the Chi of Kares. And the Mishnah Paskins that you Chayiv Knas. Who is this Tana? And this is a kash on Reish Lakish. Why? Because Pishlaim, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he could say that we're talking about a case of Lo Hisrubo. And since Lo Hisrubo, there's no Chi of Malchus Befal, and that's why you pay Mammon in the case of Baal Achosa. But according to Reish Lakish rules that even in Chayvei Malchus Shogegin, you're parted from Tashlumin. So how do we understand that in our Mishnah, if we reject Rabbi Mechuni ben Akana, who holds that Karis patters you up from Tashlumin, and we hold that Karis does not patter you up from Tashlumin, but wait a second, we're talking about a case of Chayvei Malchus Shogegin. And Chayvei Malchus Shogegin patters you from Tashlum. And the Gemara says the following. There are two options. I don't know why you're getting so uptight about it. Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir holds that there's a Chi of Malchus that doesn't patter up Tashlumin, but rather Lokim Mishalim fine. Sam Mishnah is like Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yitzchak, who holds that there's no Chi of Malchus in Chayvei Krisis. Because whenever the Torah says you Chayvei Krisis, you don't get Malchus, so we understand very well why, in the case of Achoso, the Mishnah says he pays Knas. Tana Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa, Rayos, Ushnios, Larayos, Einleim, Lo Knas, Lo Pitui. And the Gemara is going to have a problem here. In the case of Shnios, Larayos, that's only the Rabbanon. On a Deraisa level, then certainly there should be a Chi of Knas. Amemai Enes. So she was married off by her mother or brothers as a Kana, and she had beer, therefore she's not a Besula, Einlam Knas, below Pitui. There's no onus of the Knas for onus, and there's no onus of Pitui. because in both cases the Torah requires a besula. Then the Brisa goes on to say, Islandess ain't lo knas v'lo pitu. Islandess is a woman who jumps from katnus and at the age of 20 over to bagus. She never passes through that middle stage of naros. And the Torah says, as regard to knas, both in the case of Otis and Mafata, she's a nara. This woman is not a nara. And finally, Ayotzis Mishum Shemra, where he had a relationship with her and he claimed lo matzasi lebitcha besulin and lo knas lo pitu. Now, this is very strange because we're talking about an asua, and when he consummated the marriage, he found her to be a ba'ula. But what difference it makes? The asua in itself should remove the knas, because every woman who goes into the chuppah is bechezkas ba'ula. But we have to say that we're talking about a case, as the Gemara is going to say later, where Aiden testified to nichnas al chuppah v'lo nivala. But nevertheless, his claim was substantiated by Aiden that there was no dam b'sulin. So Gemara asks, "My arayos my shnius l'arayos." Ilay my arayos. Here we turn to Daf Lamed Vav. Arayos mamish, which means there's an Isur Torah. The shnios is midivrei sofrim. Right, so there's one step removed. It's not a man with his daughter, a man with his granddaughter, man or a man with his mother's mother, and so forth. So that's only Drabanan. If that be the case, came into the Raisa Chazile, Amai Eid Lo Knas. On a Doraisa level, she is certainly Chazile. She's Ru'ilo. And therefore, we're going to go into again the machlokas between Shimon HaTimni and Rav Shimon ben Menasya about the connection between and the interdependence between Knas and the marriage mitzvah, whether it means that Yesh Ba Havaya, or whether it means Yachal L'Kaima, Ru'il L'Kaima or not. Again, we'll go over that again tomorrow, there, because we ran out of time today. And in both cases, on a Doraisa level, it's Ru'il L'Kaima and it's Yesh Ba Havaya. So no matter how you slice the cake, there should be Knas. How could this Brisa say that in Shnius L'Arayos there's no Knas, unless we assume that Arayos and Shnius L'Arayos are talking about two different levels of punishment. One is a Chiyuv Bisa, and Shnios is only a Chiyuv La. And that in Mitzvah Hashem we'll pick up tomorrow. What time do we get together tomorrow?
Tomorrow is
Thursday.
6:10
6:10 or 1:10 on our time. Great.
Yeah.
See you then.
Okay.
And I beg you not to have any nightmares about all these cases of Chiyuv Malkus and Chiyuv Misa.